From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And coming up today, K-State's Doug Jardine will go over the steps for testing crop fields for soybean cyst nematodes. He says that now is an excellent time to collect those soil samples for that test. Then one of the new district fire management officers with the Kansas Forest Service, Chris Hanson, will talk about the new role that he and his counterparts around the state are serving in rural fire department training and support. As part of that, he describes how he was put to work right away, responding to that large Cherry Creek wildfire in northwest Kansas. Further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee on a proposal to remove the least tern from the endangered species list. Plus more here on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Well, we've brought by once more Doug Jardine, row crop disease specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Obviously, the growing season is now behind us, but it's an opportunity to look back on the season and talk about the prevalent disease issues that you growers contended with and what we might take away from that for next year's production. Before we get into that, Doug, we want to talk about a field activity that can still be carried out on the part of soybean growers. Those who have combated or think they might be combating soybean cyst nematode in their fields, this is an optimum time for testing those fields for SCN, you say.
That is absolutely right. And sure, as we've mentioned many, many times, any time of the year that you can get out in the field with a soil probe is a good time to test for soybean cyst nematode because those cysts do not move in the soil. Unlike other nematodes that swim freely in the soil, they tend this time of year to be moving downward where it's a little warmer, and they get below the level where a soil probe would reach. But with our cyst nematodes, they're fixed in the soil and they're going to be there. And we suggest this time of year primarily because we've pretty much wrapped up the field season. Most of the crops in Kansas are in the bin now with just a few exceptions. And so people may have a little bit more free time on their hand. And even though we've had a couple of cold nights, our ground isn't frozen yet for the most part. And so we suggest that this is a good time to do it. And just to review, the optimal places to check would be in soybean fields that were just harvested, where we can still see the stubble rows. And we would like you to take cores from directly in the row because, quite frankly, that's where the nematodes are going to be if they're there, around the roots. And, maybe take 15 or 20 cores 6 to 8 inches deep over maybe about a 20-acre area of the field. And you bulk them together in a bucket and subsample. We need probably a pint of soil. Don't let it freeze, but don't let it dry out either. And they can either send it in through their local cooperative extension office. The agents will be more than happy to assist them with that. Or they can send it directly into our plant disease diagnostic lab. I would just suggest that they go to the K-State Plant Pathology webpage to get the address for that. And as a bonus, and we've talked about this previously, we are part of the Soybean Cyst Nematode Coalition. That is a group of university extension research programs and private partners, particularly some of the seed companies, as well as the North Central Soybean Program Board, which are checkoff dollars, which Kansas contributes money to. And we will not charge you for those SCN soil samples at this point in time. So it's a freebie. We don't think it's very expensive anyways, but for anybody, where costs might have been holding them back, that's one less excuse they can use.
So every reason to conduct the tests where you think they're necessary. What's the tip-off to a grower that would suggest that they might well want to test?
Okay, well, that's a good question. Let's assume you use a yield monitor and you have a pattern of yield across the field. Any place where the yield has dropped off from some reason that's not obvious, would be a good place to start looking. If, there's nothing that looks way out of whack on a yield map, we always suggest up on the headlands where you get a lot of traffic in and out of the field, because quite frankly, that's how the nematode primarily moves, is on equipment, whether it's mud on truck tires or combine tires or planters or whatever. As you go from field to field and soil drops off from the equipment from a previous field, you get an inoculation. And then typically places in the field where water may move, so along terrace channels, or if you have a field along a stream that runs out of its banks at points during the season and then goes back in, because we know those nematodes can move in the waterway. So those would be places to look.
And if one arrives at a positive test result for soybean cyst nematode, the primary remedy is still rotation?
Well, it's going to depend on the level. And if you have a positive sample based on the numbers we find, we will make a recommendation as to what your best choice is. If it's a very high number, definitely rotation. If it's a lower number, you may be fine to plant soybeans next year, although you may want to look for a different variety than what you had out there in the current year.
Quickly, Doug, before we leave the topic, if you have a field that wasn't in soybeans this year, was in corn, grain, sorghum, is it worthwhile to test likewise for nematodes?
Oh, absolutely. And then again, the headland areas of the field, waterway, terrace channels, maybe areas where historically, if you can recall the last time you had the field in soybeans, areas in the field where the soybeans don't seem to do well, but when you put corn in there, it doesn't seem to bother it. Yeah. That would be a tip-off.
Compile those composites anytime now and submit those to the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory at K-State. As Doug says, your local extension agricultural agent can be of great assistance there. Now, just a quick summary of row crop diseases in this 2019 production year, Doug. It was a wet one. Let's start by putting that out there. Most everybody understands that. Looking at beans and problems other than soybean cyst nematode, what did you observe?
Well, I think clearly this year, and this has been kind of a growing thing last year's, there's an old favorite called Phytophthora root rot. We are at the point where it's not causing the typical symptoms of the chocolate-colored lesion coming up the stem and the plant dying. It's more of where it nibbles away at the roots, and we have fields that finish prematurely. And typically we're finding this in, again, terrace channels or lower wetter areas of the field, hence where we've had a lot of rain and wetter than normal soils. We're seeing from, say, 10 years ago, a much higher level of Phytophthora than in the past. And without getting into a detailed discussion today, variety selection is going to be the way you deal with that problem. And we can maybe talk about more of that later next spring or as we get towards the growing season again. But yeah, it's a variety problem.
So that would be the one thing that the soybean growers should concentrate on.
On the upside, we had a lot of poor seed quality last year from purple seed stain and Phomopsis rot. And as far as I can tell and from what I'm hearing, we are in a much better place this year with regard to seed quality. So some good news.
Let's turn to feed grains then. What about corn? And you, as per previous conversations, picked out a couple of culprits, didn't you?
Right. Well, really, it's sort of all of the normal suspects, as they would say. Gray leaf spot kind of got off to what I thought was a slow start, but then we probably ended up with pretty close to normal levels. So fields that have a history of gray leaf spot probably should have been sprayed if they weren't, or were sprayed if they needed it. Southern rust, we've talked about how it's coming up earlier and earlier, and this year it was amazing. I was just looking at some records, and like on the 25th of June, there was a social media tweet saying that there had been no southern rust cited in the United States. And 13 days later, we had our first find of southern rust in Kansas. So in less than 2 weeks, we went from having none in the country to having it all the way up here. Fortunately for us, the very hot, dry July kept the disease in check, or we could have been in a lot worse shape than we were even with our late planted corn. There were definitely fields that should have been treated. There was a lot of questions about late season applications, and so we've talked about that earlier. We kind of had a little calculation that we would do whether it would pay you to spray or not, so hopefully guys took a look at that. Ear rots, they were out there. I don't know, probably not as bad as we had in 2018, but we've got reports of Fusarium ear rot, which produces that mycotoxin fumonicin. I think there were some trace levels of aflatoxin out there in a couple of places that just missed some rains at critical times. And there was, again, some diplodia ear rot in places. Again, I don't think as bad as it was. I know in a week or two I will be speaking to the Kansas Feed and Grain Handlers Association, specifically about ear molds and mycotoxins. So I know at least in southwest Kansas there's been some concern, and so we'll address that. And then stalk rots. And I would say primarily this year we were looking at Fusarium stalk rot, that kind of wet early, dry in the middle of the season, and then wet late again in August and September is like the prescription for Fusarium stalk rot. We did see some charcoal rot in a few areas, but I would say, maybe 95% of what we saw this year was Fusarium stalk rot. And by the way, in grain sorghum, very healthy crop. That's why we grow grain sorghum so well in Kansas. Foliar diseases, head disease is really not an issue. But again, Fusarium stalk rot for the same reasons we just talked about with corn. I can't say that I saw a lot of downed sorghum, although I don't obviously get everywhere. But it probably knocked 5 or 10% off the yields in a lot of fields.
Now, we'll be visiting come springtime about variety and hybrid selection, but briefly on corn and sorghum, are these the kinds of developments that would warrant reconsideration of hybrids going in?
Probably not too much. The key thing is to look for hybrids that are described as having good stay green and good standability. I think one of the issues in grain sorghum is that we tend to put grain sorghum on our worst ground, upland ground that might be a little droughty. We tend not to want to put a lot of fertilizer out there. We kind of cheat it a little bit, and you're just encouraging stalk rot under those conditions. So, if we can treat sorghum just a little bit nicer, we'd probably do a little bit better with it.
Good wrap-up as always, Doug, and we will talk again and get into some of the hybrid and variety selection considerations upon row crop season 2020 in a few months from now. Appreciate the word. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Doug Jardine, row crop disease specialist, K-State Research and Extension, with us on this opening segment of Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Well, we have had our first large-scale wildfire in rural Kansas for this season, and unfortunately more are to come in all likelihood. But this one took place just a few days back in far northwest Kansas. We bring that up today because it's a good way to illustrate something that's happened in the state of Kansas that will hopefully help greatly with wildland fire suppression in the state. We brought by now the newly named District Fire Management Officer for Northwest Kansas in the Kansas Forest Service at Kansas State University, welcoming for the first time, of course, Chris Hanson, who was directly involved in fighting that wildfire, the Cherry Creek Fire by name, in Northwest Kansas. Chris, welcome to you, first of all.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it.
Tell us a bit about your career in fire suppression to let folks know about you.
So a little bit about my career in fire. I've been in this job for 10 years, and I started down in Texas with the local volunteer department and then made my way into the federal side of the fire service, working on engine crews, hotshot crews, hand crews as well. I recently came from Big Bend National Park, where I was the hand crew superintendent for the Los Diablos.
So you've been on the front lines, obviously, a fair amount.
Yes, sir. Most definitely.
So you've come to Kansas just within the last few months then, is that correct?
Yes, within actually just a month. So a month here and already getting on my first fire.
It didn't take long, did it?
Did not.
Want to have you describe this position that you occupy now. Again, District Fire Management Officer, Kansas Forest Service. In Northwest Kansas, you have two other counterparts in the state as well. What does this particular role entail?
So this particular role is to basically get an entity down into the northwest part of the state. And with that, we are doing training for these local volunteer and career departments. And then also doing such things as mitigation projects as well too, community outreach projects such as the NFPA Firewise program and the Smoky Bear educational program as well too.
So it's part of prevention, obviously. It's part of assisting those responding units all around the state.
Yes, sir. When it comes down to that, as far as prevention goes, that's a big part of our position, is to get that training out to those departments, get the education out to the public.
And again, there are two others that are serving this same capacity in Kansas?
Yes, we have a Southwest District Fire Management Officer, Aaron Williams, and then we have an Eastern, which is Bryce Haverkamp.
So when you work with volunteer fire departments, and the vast majority of rural departments are very much reliant on volunteers, you are literally going to those departments with educational initiatives and efforts? What?
Yeah, so we're going and we're setting up times to instruct what's called NWCG courses, the National Wildland Coordinating Group. And this material that we teach is from the basic introductory wildland firefighter course up to whatever they may need.
So you respond to whatever they're inquiring about as well?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Whatever courses they're wanting, whether it's, again, the introductory course or to advanced incident commander courses, we can get those out to them.
What you're providing to fire departments out there and volunteers, material that will complement their experiences and their previous training in responding to fire.
Yes, sir. So our supplemental training that we'll provide to them is the NWCG courses to help get them the training that they need so they can better fight these fires and have a good understanding of fire behavior when they go out there and suppress these.
Now, again, back to the origins of this. This is upon an initiative that was approved by the Kansas Legislature. What are your hopes for this as you get deeper into this, Chris?
So definitely my hopes, especially within my district, are to get all of these rural departments and career departments up to speed on the training that they need when it pertains to wildland firefighting. It'll make our efforts when it comes time for suppression, make it much easier because everybody will essentially be on the same page as far as tactics and having the knowledge of what it takes to put out these fires. But then also educating these communities of how to be fire-wise. And then, from there we can hopefully we won't see a complete eradication of wildfire, of course, but hopefully see a much smaller scale events occur in the future.
As you say, you were thrown right into the fray before really even getting settled in your new position in northwest Kansas. Speak to a moment about the Cherry Creek fire and the approach to suppression and control there and how your role fit into that.
So the Cherry Creek fire stretched about 20 miles of Highway 36, and then north on Highway 27, with about 30 individual starts all along that stretch. When I made my way to the incident, I could see a column of smoke from Norton County, so definitely knew we had something on our hands. With arrival there, we did have our new tanker 95, en route, so once it got there and I was there, my role, I fell into air operations as far as coordinating water drops with Tanker 95's pilot and the ground resources.
So again, this is an air tanker and the first opportunity for it to be deployed here in Kansas, correct?
Yes, sir. And for its first mission, it did an outstanding job. Yeah. We were very pleased with its results. It helped us get a good wrap along the perimeter as far as cooling down those edges very quickly.
And you did as well interact with various volunteer departments in that whole area, assuming that there were quite a few.
Yes, we had
on board.
We had multiple volunteer departments from all surrounding counties, Nebraska and also Colorado as well too. And without the efforts of those local VFDs and other rural departments, we never would have got a handle on this as quickly as we did.
So containment took place within a day or two? What?
About the second operational period is when we saw good containment. And then, of course, with the weather that they had blow in on Monday, that kind of helped solidify everything as far as with containing and controlling it.
And damage minimal?
There was some minimal damage, I know, to one or two structures, just going off of the emergency manager's report initially when I got briefed in. But as far as any kind of substantial damage to the town of St. Francis or Wheeler, none there.
Yeah. But again, this is an opportunity for you to observe how volunteer fire operations work in the state of Kansas. And did it tell you a little bit of something about the potential for wildland fire danger as we move forward into this winter then, Chris?
It does. Specifically my district up in the Northwest, I've noticed from what I can tell, a pretty abnormal amount of excessive fuel loading, and this is coming back from feedback from the locals. So we could see some increased fire behavior when fire season does come around.
And Chris, for the layperson who may not be familiar with the jargon, when you're talking about fuel load, you're talking about the combustible material that may exist across the countryside, dried pastures, for instance, and the like.
Yes, or any kind of combustible vegetation, anything along those lines. That's what we're talking about when we discuss fuel loading. It's just the amount of that vegetation available.
And coupled then with the atmospheric conditions, low humidity, for instance, as well as the dryness, all of this blends together to create a fire hazard, even to the point of red flag warnings certain days.
It does. So your red flag warnings are particularly with temperatures, low RHs, and high winds. But the low RHs and the winds do all play a factor when it comes to the fire danger that we see out in our counties.
And the caution is out to everybody who is active in any way in rural Kansas and elsewhere for that matter. So how can personnel involved in local volunteer fire response take advantage of what you're providing in the way of education, information, and training? Do they contact you? How does that work?
So they can contact us, the district fire management officers who are in their area. They can contact the headquarters. But we're really making efforts to get out ourselves, to go out to every county, go out to every department, and be able to meet face-to-face with these department heads so we can build that relationship with them and get them what they need.
And that's the point. You can tailor what you provide directly to the need for training on an individual department basis.
Exactly. And like I said, it works out great for them because, like you said, we can tailor it to meet exactly what they want.
And your contact information can be found where?
It can be found on the KFS website. And then also I can leave you guys some information as well, too.
Well, good to have you on board, Chris, and hopefully you won't be overly active this fall and winter, but chances are that you'll be getting after it on the front lines. But more importantly, we'll be interacting with our fire departments around the state of Kansas and the volunteers that staff those departments and helping advance the cause of wildland fire control and suppression here in the state. Good to have you aboard.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it.
And thanks for stopping by right here. Once again, he was appointed to this post just a few weeks ago as the District Fire Management Officer for Northwest Kansas, Kansas Forest Service, Chris Hanson. And again, he had very little time on the job before he was very much involved in that Cherry Creek fire, which took place in Cheyenne County, Northwest Kansas, just a few days back. If you'd like to know more about how the District Fire Officer services work and how to contact Chris or his colleagues elsewhere in the state, simply go to this web address, kansasforests.org. That's kansasforests.org, and click on the tab on the left-hand side of the page that's marked Fire Management. You'll find all you need to know right there. Agriculture Today continues in a few moments on the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back to the Tuesday edition of Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Next up, today's agricultural news headlines in brief. These courtesy in part of DTN. Starting with the weekly Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report from the USDA for the week ending on Sunday. Now, our topsoil moisture in the state 1% surplus, 52% adequate, but now 47% short to very short. Subsoil moisture at 1% surplus, 62% adequate, and 37% short to very short. The condition of the Kansas winter wheat crop is at 47% good to excellent this week. That's slippage from last week. 35% fair, 18% poor to very poor. Winter wheat emergence is at 86%, right on the average. Well, the corn harvest, in fact, the row crop harvests in total are all but complete. Corn harvest, 95% done now. Soybeans, 92% complete. And the grain sorghum harvest at 92% done. The cotton harvest in Kansas is 44% complete, according to the USDA. Nationwide, the corn harvest has reached 76% completion, behind the 5-year average of 92%. Breaking it down, North Dakota, 23% harvested. Michigan, only 39%. Wisconsin, 44%. South Dakota at 53%. Meanwhile, soybean harvest reaching 91% nationally as of Sunday. That's only slightly behind the average for the date. And as of Sunday, 95% of the winter wheat was planted, right on the average. Winter wheat emergence nationally at 83%, also near the average. And sorghum harvest, 93%. Cotton harvest estimated at 68% complete. Midwest lawmakers are pressing the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to address issues with propane supply problems in the region, which are impacting producers as they seek to dry down this year's corn crop. A group of House lawmakers, led by House Agriculture Committee Chairman Colin Peterson, have noted that trucks have been running from Kansas and Texas to bring additional supplies back to the Midwest. And they say, quoting here, "We appreciate efforts taken by several state governors and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration to assist companies in that effort." Iowa Republican Senators Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst, meantime, have also penned a letter to FERC Chairman Neil Chatterjee asking the regulator to address the situation. A former USDA secretary sees the potential of increased U.S. dairy export opportunities in Japan once a trade agreement begins operating between the two nations. Here's more from the USDA's Rod Bain.
A U.S.-Japanese trade agreement would mean significant opportunity for our nation's dairy exports.
It's going to allow us to avoid what we have been seeing in this market, which was a challenge for us in the powder market in Japan. Our friends in the EU and our friends in New Zealand, who are our competitors, had the benefit of free trade agreements that basically eliminated tariffs. This Japanese agreement will allow us to get at the same level as they are, so we will be much more competitive on powder.
Former Agriculture Secretary and current President and CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council, Tom Vilsack, speaking to farm broadcasters this week, added,
"Our cheese sales in Japan were continuing to go up. This agreement will guarantee that we won't have a tariff differential with our friends in the EU."
The Japanese diet still needs to ratify the mini-FTA, something Vilsack believes will happen in the coming weeks, which should boost U.S. dairy promotional efforts in that market. From the National Association of Farm Broadcasting Convention in Kansas City, I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And that takes us right into this week's Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers about some positive news as we look at milk price moving into 2020. Looks like we'll see a gradual increase in raw milk prices on our dairy farms as we move into 2020. Not sure exactly how many months that will run into the year, but probably a ways into the year. And we're already seeing some of the relief in our milk checks as we see those come in over the last few weeks. So, some things I want to remind us about is we start to see an increase in milk price. We may start to let our guard down on some other things in our dairy operations. Probably not the time to do that. We feel that probably these increases that we're seeing in current milk price may be fairly short-lived, may only run halfway through 2020, and then we'll maybe see a gradual decline in milk price as we go toward the end of 2020. So what are some things that I think dairy farmers need to be thinking about? Well, obviously feed cost is still a major part of what we do every day. So it's also a major opportunity for us. So as you start to watch what's going on in the grain markets, keeping in mind that we've got probably an ample supply of corn and soybeans around the world, as new market data becomes available, we're going to see some ups and downs probably in those markets. That may impact our feed prices depending on what we're doing with our nutritionist. So some things to think about as you think about your feed cost and how do you control that where you have some fluctuation in the feed market. You need to be monitoring that on a fairly close basis just so that you understand what may be coming down the road and also be able to pick out opportunities that you might have for your purchase feeds. Now, some other things that you need to really work with your nutritionist on is just your efficiency of utilization of energy and protein within your dairy herd. Most of us get milk urea nitrogen results back on every load of milk that we ship. Pay attention to those. If those start to climb above 14, you really need to be having a discussion with your nutritionist about why that is going on. It's a lot of different factors that might be associated with that, and it could just be that the protein content in the diet needs to be adjusted slightly. However, it also could mean that there's some other things that need to be tweaked in the diet so that cows actually produce more milk and thus the MUN level would drop on its own. For those of you that are on DHIA testing, you can watch that on an individual cow basis. Again, probably most important to pay attention to those animals that are early in lactation. Now, as you look at the overall operation of your farm and you think about overall farm efficiencies, where are the greatest opportunities generally? Generally with your transition cows. Getting those animals off to a good start on this lactation can actually add another 2,000 to 5,000 pounds onto the lactation. On a daily basis, that may be 5 to 10 pounds of milk per cow per day. So if we're losing on the transition program on our dairy herd, it's going to be hard to take advantage of some of the advantages that we might get on milk price and also more stable or lower feed costs. Keep in mind that what we do with transition cows also affects probably when we're going to get those animals pregnant. So there's also an impact on the future lactation as well. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to enjoy an increase in milk price, but keep in mind that we still have to keep our pencils sharp when it comes to nutrition and transition cow management.
Thanks, Mike. And this is Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today returns now, and we're welcoming back in for his weekly visit wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. Well, Charlie, you tell us today of a success story, recovery efforts for a particular bird found in Kansas, the least tern. Tell us about this.
Well, the least tern is a species in the tern family. Terns are generally considered to be seabirds, but several species are also found along rivers, lakes, and other wetland environments. We do have least terns in Kansas. They feed primarily on fish, small fish, and they nest along about 2,800 miles of river channel across the Great Plains and the lower Mississippi Valley. They winter down in the Caribbean and South America. It's a species that in the 19th and 20th centuries, they were decimated by harvest for their feathers. Those feathers were used in hats. Their nesting habitats were flooded or degraded by construction of dams and other forms of channelization of the rivers that was done in the mid-20th century. Because of those actions, the population declined and was listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act in 1985 as a distinct population segment of the least tern.
And it was also listed in Kansas as endangered a couple of years after that, you say?
Yes, they are summer residents in Kansas. We've got nesting birds that's been recorded in 6 central and western Kansas counties. Also have nested at Jeffrey Energy Center and along the Kansas River. They require barren areas near the water such as salt flats in salt marshes and sandbars and riverbeds. One of the hazards is the vegetation, including woody and trees that come back on sand islands in the Kansas River and on down into the Missouri and into the Mississippi River. Those islands were not subject, because of some of the dams, were not subject to the major flood events that swept that vegetation clear of those sandbars. So there's been some changes there in the way the rivers have been managed that have allowed some of those nesting habitats to flourish, and we're seeing quite a response. When they were listed, there were only about 2,000 least terns and only a couple of dozen nesting sites. Currently, they estimate about 18,000 interior least terns at almost 500 nesting sites in 18 states. And that's really a testament to the conservation efforts and the partnerships between local landowners, but primarily the Corps of Engineers in the way they manage the river system.
Therefore, there is a proposal out there now to delist the least tern from the endangered species list.
Yeah, so that proposal was published in the Federal Register in late October. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is requesting comments on this proposal to delist, and those comments must be submitted prior to December 23rd of this year. That doesn't mean, if the species is delisted, that the least tern would not have any other protection. It would continue to be protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which protects the bird, its parts, eggs, and nest from take and trade, just like many, many other species of migratory birds. We will have to yet wait and see what would happen to the listing in Kansas, but typically those changes would soon follow after a delisting at the federal level.
Well, if delisting does in fact occur, how important is this for land use interests? Because you say in the past the listing of the least tern has caused some complications.
Well, those complications are often cause projects to be reviewed. Some developers think that those are unnecessary. They cause delays, and frankly, they cause some changes to some projects. But I think these issues have been worked out along the big expanses of the rivers, and we've seen significant changes there. I would expect that the areas that have been designated for critical habitat would go away under the delisting process. That would reduce perhaps the regulatory burden that some folks feel is onerous when they're dealing with endangered species on construction or development projects that require the assistance of federal dollars.
So again, the public has how long to comment on this proposed delisting? What's the deadline?
The deadline, I believe, is December 23rd of 2019. That allows the public the opportunity to comment until that particular time.
And what does this say about efforts to recover endangered species? This, once more, is a good ending, if you will, if in fact the delisting occurs. So it suggests that something has been accomplished here.
Yeah, I think it shows that with enough effort and probably enough funding, agencies can coordinate habitat well enough to see a change in the trajectory of species populations. But keep in mind that it's a situation that requires lots of entities to be involved over large expanses of landscape in order to get these type population changes. We know a species that nests here in Kansas that then winters in South America. That's a lot of habitat in between where changes can be detrimental to that survival of that particular species. But I think in this case, they determined that the species needed additional nesting sites, and the Corps, which coordinates the range-wide monitoring events, showed that they could increase population trends during the last 20 years because of some changes they make in the way they manage the river systems and also in reviewing the permits and required changes that may be necessary to avoid negatively impacting the least tern. Most of that is habitat degradation or loss and changes of management. But I think this shows that endangered species has the opportunity to work when we look at all of the impacts that are necessary to change populations.
Very well. Once again, the least tern found at numerous wetland areas in Kansas, and it is on schedule perhaps to be removed from the endangered species lists. That is a proposal now out there from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Charlie, thanks for briefing us on this right here. Wildlife Specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. And our thanks to you as well for tuning in. We hope you'll rejoin us this same time tomorrow right here. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.